You've been told your crypto is safe because of math, unbreakable math, the kind that would take the world's fastest supercomputer longer than the age of the universe to crack. That was true, past tense, because in the spring of 2026, that assumption quietly stopped being true, and almost nobody outside a handful of labs noticed. Let's start with what your wallet actually is, because most people get this wrong. Your Bitcoin, your Ethereum, none of it actually lives inside your wallet app or your hardware device. It lives on the blockchain, a public ledger that anyone on Earth can look at. What your wallet holds is a private key, a massive random number invisible to everyone but you, that proves you have the right to move the coins sitting at a particular address. From that private key, using a specific branch of mathematics, a public key gets generated. That public key is what the network sees when you send a transaction. It's the proof that you are who you say you are without ever revealing the private key itself. For more than 15 years, this system has been treated as close to unbreakable. Not because nobody has tried, but because the math involved, elliptic curve cryptography, is so computationally brutal that reversing it, going from a public key back to a private key, would take a classical computer longer than the universe has existed. That's not an exaggeration. That's the actual estimate. Trillions of years, using every computer on the planet running in parallel. It's the reason billions of dollars in digital assets have sat untouched, protected by nothing but a mathematical wall nobody could climb. Quantum computers were always the theoretical exception. Everybody in cryptography knew this day was coming eventually. There's even a specific algorithm developed by a mathematician named Peter Shor back in 1994 that describes exactly how a sufficiently powerful quantum computer could tear through that wall. Shor's algorithm doesn't brute force the problem the way a normal computer would. It exploits the strange properties of quantum mechanics, superposition, entanglement, to solve the underlying math in a fraction of the time. Where a classical computer has to check possibilities essentially one after another, a quantum computer can, in a sense, explore an enormous number of possibilities simultaneously, collapsing that exploration down into an answer far faster than anything built on classical logic gates ever could. For decades, this was treated as science fiction. A quantum computer capable of running Shor's algorithm against real-world cryptography would need thousands of stable, error-corrected qubits, meaning quantum bits that hold their state reliably long enough to complete a calculation without collapsing into noise, and nothing close to that existed. Every few years, a new prototype would get announced, a new milestone would get celebrated in a press release, and cryptographers would shrug and say, essentially, come back when you have thousands of clean, stable qubits working together, instead of a few dozen that barely hold a coherent state for a few seconds. So the threat sat in academic papers, discussed at conferences, occasionally mentioned in a footnote, and mostly ignored by everyone holding actual money on the blockchain. Then came the spring of 2026. Google released new research, and it wasn't a small incremental step. It was the kind of finding that makes cryptographers stop what they're doing and read the paper twice. The research showed that breaking the specific type of elliptic curve cryptography used by Bitcoin and Ethereum could be done with dramatically fewer quantum resources than anyone had previously calculated. Not a modest improvement. A steep drop in the number of qubits required, and a streamlined set of computational steps that shortened the theoretical attack window in a way that stunned people who had spent their careers estimating these timelines. Google's analysis broke the threat down into 3 categories. The first is a static wallet attack, where an old exposed public key sitting untouched on the blockchain becomes a target, with no need to wait for the owner to do anything. The second is transaction interception, where an attacker races to extract a private key in the brief window between when a transaction is broadcast and when it's confirmed on the network. The third is a deeper, more structural attack on protocol-level weaknesses, the kind of thing that could ripple through an entire blockchain's architecture rather than just one wallet. Each of these represents a different door into the vault, and Google's research suggested all 3 doors were closer to being pried open than the industry had assumed. Then, about a week after that research made headlines, a report combining findings from Google, Caltech, and quantum research groups produced a number that made the story impossible to ignore. According to that analysis, by the year 2029, a sufficiently advanced quantum computer could theoretically crack open some of the earliest Bitcoin wallets on the network, including wallets widely believed to belong to Bitcoin's own creator, the pseudonymous figure known as Satoshi Nakamoto, in as little as 9 minutes. 9 minutes to unlock coins that have not moved since Bitcoin's earliest days, currently worth somewhere around $75 billion, representing more than 5% of Bitcoin's entire limited supply of 21 million coins. Sit with that for a second. Not 15 years of brute force computation, not a data center running around the clock for a decade, 9 minutes. Now, before you panic and start moving every coin you own into a bunker, it's important to understand something the loudest headlines conveniently leave out. This threat is not evenly distributed. It's not a single switch that flips and suddenly every wallet on Earth becomes vulnerable at once. The danger is concentrated, specifically, on wallets whose public keys are already visible on the blockchain. Here's why that distinction matters so much. When you receive cryptocurrency to a modern wallet address and never spend from it, your public key typically stays hidden. What's visible on the blockchain instead is a hashed version of that address, a scrambled fingerprint that doesn't reveal the underlying public key. But the moment you spend from that address, in order to prove ownership and authorize the transaction, your public key gets exposed on-chain, out in the open, for anyone or anything to see. For older wallets, and for a huge number of legacy Bitcoin addresses created in the network's first several years, the situation is even worse. Many of those early formats expose the public key by default, whether the owner ever spends the coins or not. Those coins have effectively been sitting in a glass case with a sign on it reading, "Solve this puzzle and it's yours," for over a decade. The only thing standing between an attacker and the funds has been the raw difficulty of the math, and that difficulty is exactly what's now eroding. Research analysts have tried to quantify how much of the total supply falls into this exposed category, and the numbers are staggering. Estimates suggest more than 2 million Bitcoin, sitting in dormant wallets, could be vulnerable under the kind of quantum attack scenarios researchers are now describing. On the Ethereum side, the exposure is arguably even broader. More than 20 million Ether, according to some estimates, exists in wallets where the public key has already been revealed through past transactions. And Ethereum carries an additional layer of complexity that Bitcoin mostly avoids. Because Ethereum is a programmable blockchain, hosting smart contracts, decentralized applications, complex account structures, and layered governance systems, a quantum breakthrough doesn't just threaten simple wallet theft. It threatens validator signatures, the consensus mechanism that keeps the entire network honest, systems that manage data availability across the chain, and even certain types of cryptographic proofs used to keep transactions private and efficient. In other words, on Ethereum, a quantum attack isn't just a story about stolen coins. It's potentially a story about the integrity of the network itself, the trust that transactions settle the way they're supposed to, and the confidence that the rules governing billions of dollars in decentralized finance can't be quietly rewritten by whoever gets to a working quantum machine first. It's also worth pointing out that this isn't purely a hypothetical accounting exercise happening on a spreadsheet somewhere. These exposed coins belong to real people, real institutions, real exchanges holding customer funds in cold storage, and in some cases, entire foundations and early investment funds whose treasuries are sitting in wallets created a decade or more ago, back when nobody thought carefully about which address format they were using, because nobody needed to. This is where things get genuinely uncomfortable, because there's an even sneakier version of this threat that doesn't require anyone to wait for a working quantum computer at all. It's called Harvest Now, Decrypt Later, and it describes a strategy that sophisticated, well-resourced attackers, including state-level actors, are almost certainly already running today. The idea is simple and deeply unsettling. You don't need a quantum computer right now to steal encrypted data. You just need to copy it and store it patiently, waiting for the day quantum computers are capable of cracking it open. Encrypted files, intercepted communications, and yes, publicly exposed blockchain data can all be harvested today and sit in cold storage for years, decrypted the moment the technology catches up. For blockchain specifically, this means every public key that has ever been exposed on-chain is already, in a sense, a ticking clock. It doesn't matter if the quantum computer capable of cracking it arrives in 3 years or 9 years. The data needed to attack it has already been copied and is sitting somewhere, waiting. Think about what that actually means for a moment. It means the race isn't only about who builds the first working quantum computer. It's about who has already been quietly collecting the ammunition for years, patiently, without anyone noticing, because the collecting part doesn't require any breakthrough at all. Anyone with enough storage and enough patience can scrape a public blockchain today and archive every exposed public key sitting on it for free, right now, this afternoon, and simply wait. That's the part of this story that unsettles cryptographers more than almost anything else. The attack doesn't begin the day the quantum computer switches on. In a very real sense, for exposed wallets, it may have already begun. Naturally, this triggered a wave of debate across the crypto industry, and it's worth understanding both sides of that argument rather than just absorbing the scariest version of the story. On one side, you have researchers who argue the threat, while real, is still being wildly overstated for clicks and attention. Analysts at Galaxy Digital, one of the more respected research shops in the space, published a report making a specific and important point. Most wallets, they argued, are not vulnerable today because funds are only genuinely at risk when a public key has actually been exposed on the blockchain, not simply because quantum computers exist somewhere in a lab. They emphasize that developers across the ecosystem have been actively working on solutions since well before this story went mainstream. rejecting the idea that Bitcoin's core development community has been sitting on its hands, ignoring the problem. Other skeptics point to the sheer physical scale of what's required to actually run Shor's algorithm against real-world Bitcoin encryption. Cracking the specific standard Bitcoin relies on would require, by some estimates, millions of stable, error-corrected qubits, sustained for long enough to complete the calculation without the whole system collapsing into noise, which is one of the single hardest unsolved engineering problems in physics. A financial research note published by Bernstein in April of 2026 estimated that a meaningful, credible quantum threat to crypto wallets is still somewhere between 3 and 5 years away at minimum, and stressed that even that estimate assumes hardware capable of the task eventually gets built at all. On the other side, you have people who point out, correctly, that the trajectory of quantum hardware has consistently outpaced expectations, and that betting your $75 billion on it probably won't happen soon is a strange kind of gamble. Caltech researchers, examining this specific type of attack Google described, found that on a different style of quantum hardware, using neutral atoms instead of the superconducting circuits most people picture when they hear quantum computer, the number of physical qubits required could drop to somewhere between 10 and 26,000. That's still a big number, but it's dramatically smaller than the millions previously assumed necessary, and it's a number that starts to feel achievable within a normal human planning horizon, rather than a distant science fiction one. IBM, for context, already operates a superconducting quantum processor exceeding 1,100 qubits. Companies working with neutral atom architecture, including Quera and Atom Computing, have already demonstrated systems approaching that same physical scale. The gap between theoretically possible and sitting in a data center has been shrinking faster than almost anyone in the crypto world expected, and that's precisely why the story exploded the way it did in 2026. It's not that quantum computers can break your wallet today. It's that the runway everyone assumed they had turned out to be shorter than advertised. The trend line keeps bending in the wrong direction. So what is actually being done about it? Because here's the good news buried under all of this. The people who built and maintain these networks are not sitting around waiting for disaster. The Ethereum Foundation formed a dedicated team specifically focused on this problem, appropriately named the Post-Quantum Team, and their work is already shaping Ethereum's roadmap. Vitalik Buterin, Ethereum's co-founder, has been publicly candid about where the vulnerabilities live. He's specifically called out validator signatures, the everyday signatures used in regular wallet transactions, the systems responsible for data availability across the network, and certain types of zero-knowledge proofs as areas that need to be hardened against a quantum future. His proposed solution for validators is to shift toward hash-based signatures, a completely different cryptographic approach that doesn't rely on the elliptic curve Math Shor's algorithm is designed to exploit. Hash-based schemes are considered dramatically more resistant to quantum attacks precisely because breaking them requires a fundamentally different kind of computational effort that quantum computers aren't especially good at. The Ethereum Foundation's own internal estimate, notably, is less alarmist than some of the headlines. Their engineering roadmap currently places the realistic window for a cryptographically relevant quantum threat somewhere in the early to mid-2030s. Which is why they've deliberately chosen a gradual, staged migration path instead of rushing into a single disruptive hard fork that could introduce new bugs or new vulnerabilities in the process of trying to fix an old one. Bitcoin's response has taken a slightly different shape, partly because Bitcoin's governance model is more conservative and more resistant to sweeping protocol changes by design. One of the more interesting developments has come from an unexpected direction: zero-knowledge proof technology, specifically a type known as Starks. Unlike a lot of modern cryptography, Starks are built on cryptographic hash functions rather than the kind of number theory problems that make elliptic curve cryptography so vulnerable to quantum attacks in the first place. In 2026, Zcash and several Bitcoin Layer 2 projects, including systems built on a technology called BitVM, began actively integrating Stark-based approaches, essentially building quantum resistance into new layers of infrastructure without needing to rewrite Bitcoin's base protocol from scratch. It's a clever workaround, and one that gives the ecosystem a fighting chance to adapt without a single, chaotic, all-or-nothing transition. But there's a genuinely controversial idea circulating now too, one that goes far beyond ordinary technical upgrades, and it deserves to be talked about honestly. It concerns exactly the wallets we mentioned earlier, the dormant, decade-old Bitcoin addresses, including the ones widely believed to belong to Satoshi Nakamoto. Some prominent voices in the industry, including J.P. Richardson, who runs the crypto wallet company Exodus, have argued that if nothing is done, coins sitting in those old, exposed addresses could eventually be stolen by whoever builds a working quantum computer first. His proposed solution is drastic. Update Bitcoin's protocol so that coins in these old, vulnerable addresses simply become unspendable permanently protecting them from theft by essentially freezing them forever. Those Satoshi-linked wallets alone account for roughly 1.1 million Bitcoin, and they're part of a broader group of around 6.9 million coins researchers have flagged as the most exposed to a quantum-based attack. Under one version of this proposal, the community could set a hard deadline, requiring every wallet to migrate to quantum-resistant addresses by a certain date, and any coins left behind in old vulnerable formats. After that date would effectively become permanently locked, unspendable by anyone, including their rightful owners. It's a proposal that touches something close to sacred in the crypto world, the idea that nobody, not developers, not governments, not the network itself, gets to decide your coins are no longer yours. Whether that trade-off, security against theft versus the founding principle of absolute ownership, is worth making is a debate that is nowhere close to settled, and it's likely to get louder, more emotional, and more politically charged within the Bitcoin community as the underlying quantum threat becomes more concrete and less theoretical with each passing year. So where does that leave you, the person listening to this, holding crypto in a wallet somewhere, wondering if you should be worried? The honest answer is nuanced, and nuance doesn't always make for a great headline, but it's the truth. If your funds sit in a modern wallet address, one that has never spent from it, meaning your public key has never been exposed on the blockchain, you are, for the moment, in a meaningfully safer category. The recommendation researchers and wallet companies have converged on is to use what's called native SegWit addresses on Bitcoin, the ones that start with BC1, and to avoid reusing addresses for multiple transactions. Every time you spend from an address and then receive new funds back into that same address, you're increasing your exposure, because your public key is now sitting in plain sight on a permanent public ledger that isn't going anywhere. The practical fix is straightforward, even if it takes a little more effort. Generate a new receiving address for every transaction where possible. Move funds out of old legacy format addresses into modern ones, especially if those older addresses have exposed public keys sitting on chain from previous transactions. If you're holding significant value in cold storage that hasn't moved in years, this is worth actively reviewing rather than assuming it's fine simply because nothing bad has happened yet. For everyday holders with smaller amounts sitting in modern exchange accounts or mainstream wallet apps, the immediate risk is genuinely low, and it's worth saying that clearly so this doesn't turn into needless panic. Exchanges and major custodians are watching this issue closely. They have direct financial incentive to stay ahead of it, and they will almost certainly implement post-quantum protections well before any of this becomes an active, real-world exploit. This is not a today problem for the average person with a modest balance sitting on a reputable platform. Hardware wallet manufacturers are part of this conversation too, and it's worth knowing they're not standing still either. Companies building the physical devices millions of people use to store their private keys offline have already begun researching side channel risks tied to post-quantum algorithms, essentially making sure that whatever new cryptographic standard eventually replaces today's elliptic curve system can actually be implemented securely on small, low-power hardware without introducing brand new vulnerabilities in the process. Multi-signature setups, where more than one private key is required to authorize a transaction, also offer an extra layer of practical protection in the meantime, since an attacker would need to compromise multiple keys, rather than just one exposed public key to move funds. None of these measures make the underlying quantum threat disappear, but they meaningfully raise the cost and complexity of actually pulling off an attack, which, in security, is often exactly the point. But it is absolutely a problem worth understanding now because the transition to quantum-resistant infrastructure across the entire crypto ecosystem is going to take years, involving coordinated upgrades across wallets, exchanges, blockchain protocols themselves, and the software that ties it all together. History has shown, again and again, that large, decentralized systems move slowly, even when everyone agrees on the direction they need to go. The earlier the industry starts, the smoother that transition will be. The later it starts, the messier and the riskier it becomes for everyone still holding exposed coins when the countdown finally runs out. And here's the part that should really stick with you, the piece of this story that goes far beyond crypto and Bitcoin and any single blockchain. This isn't just a cryptocurrency problem. Elliptic curve cryptography, the same mathematical foundation quantum computers are learning to threaten, doesn't just protect your Bitcoin wallet. It protects your online banking. It protects the padlock icon next to the address bar when you shop online. It protects government communications, encrypted messaging apps, medical records, corporate trade secrets, and virtually every secure digital interaction happening on the planet right now. Crypto wallets are simply the most visible, most quantifiable, and frankly, the most dramatic place this threat shows up first, because unlike a bank that can quietly patch its systems overnight without anyone noticing, blockchain is permanent, public, and transparent by design. Every exposed public key is sitting out in the open for anyone with the right tools, patient enough to wait, to eventually see. That's really what this story is about, underneath the 9-minute headline and the $75 billion number. It's a preview. A very public, very visible early warning of a much larger transition the entire digital world is quietly beginning to prepare for, whether most people realize it or not. Post-quantum cryptography isn't a niche academic pursuit anymore. It's becoming one of the defining infrastructure challenges of this decade. In crypto, because of its transparency and its enormous, easily quantifiable financial stakes, is simply the canary in that coal mine, singing first and loudest. So no, quantum computers are not going to empty your wallet tomorrow. That's the clickbait version of this story, and it's not accurate today. But the mathematical wall that has protected digital assets for over 15 years is no longer infinite, no longer untouchable, no longer something you can simply assume will hold forever without a second thought. It's a wall with a visible crack running through it now, one that serious researchers, serious institutions, and serious money are all watching closely. Because the timeline for when that crack becomes a breach keeps getting shorter every time somebody takes a fresh look at the math. The smart move isn't panic, it's preparation. Understand what kind of wallet you're actually using. Move away from old, exposed legacy addresses if you're holding anything significant. Pay attention as Bitcoin and Ethereum roll out their post-quantum upgrades over the coming years, because those upgrades are coming and they are going to matter. And maybe, most importantly, stop treating quantum computers can't break encryption yet as a permanent guarantee, because that sentence has an expiration date on it now, and for the first time, credible researchers are willing to put an actual number of years on that expiration instead of shrugging it off as science fiction. Think back to where we started, that quiet, comfortable assumption that your crypto is safe because the math protecting it is unbreakable. For 15 years, that assumption held, not because anyone proved it would hold forever, but because nobody had built the tool capable of testing it. In 2026, for the first time, credible researchers stopped speaking in hypotheticals and started speaking in years 3 to 5, maybe less. That shift from someday theoretically to here's an actual number is the real story buried underneath every dramatic headline about 9-minute wallet heists and Satoshi's billions. It's easy to hear a story like this and file it away as someone else's problem, a distant technical debate happening between engineers and cryptographers in rooms most of us will never sit in. But every single person holding digital assets today is, whether they realize it or not, a participant in this transition. The choices made in the next few years, by developers writing new signature schemes, by exchanges deciding when to force migrations, by ordinary holders deciding whether to move funds out of a decade-old address, will determine how smooth or how chaotic this shift ultimately turns out to be. The clock didn't just start ticking in 2026, it's been ticking the entire time. We just finally heard it.